Hello, everyone. Today we'll start talking about Thomas Aquinas. And if you look at the dates, Aquinas lived from 1225 until 1274. So he died relatively young. Our introduction to Aquinas is going to begin with his response to the ontological argument. In Aquinas' response to the ontological argument, to Anselm's ontological argument, we see a lot of the main assumptions and the way in which Aquinas thinks about the world, thinks about philosophy, thinks about investigating reality and pursuing truth. So it's a good entry point onto Aquinas' thought. We'll spend a lot more time looking at Aquinas than we did looking at Anselm. In fact, Anselm was in many ways a transitional figure, so we can start with Aquinas. But if you look at the dates, 150 years or so have passed since the time in which Anselm was writing. So there's space, there's time in between. And that unfortunately creates that Aquinas is not engaging directly with Anselm or with the immediate disciples of Anselm. And unfortunately, that means that Aquinas' take on Anselm is rather quick and simple, and it's not great. However, it does reveal a lot of crucial assumptions about Aquinas' own way of thinking. So it's good to start that way. So here's some basic facts about Aquinas. He is now a saint, is declared a saint by the Catholic Church. He's arguably the greatest theologian in history, and there have been some very impressive theologians. So to compete for this title is to be extremely impressive, intellectually speaking. He's also arguably one of the greatest philosophers in history, and also there have been some very impressive philosophers. So to compete for this title is also something extremely impressive. He died relatively young again, and yet, despite his early departure, he was extremely prolific. He wrote a lot of stuff, and not just like random, like ramblings or long-windedness kind of articles or books or novels. Very careful, very meticulous, very concise philosophical works are his main kind of way of writing. One of his masterpieces is the Summa Theologica (ST), abbreviated as ST, and that work alone is the greatest of the biggest of his works. It's roughly 4,500 pages of our pages, so it's a massive undertaking. And it's structured logically. It's structured in such a way that it builds logically from a starting point. So it's not only massive, it's clearly organized, very well organized, and it builds in a particular way. In that Summa Theologica ST, it's only a fraction, in fact, a tiny fraction of what he wrote. He wrote roughly 60 works, some of which are small, some of which are very large. But the whole corpus, his whole corpus, something in the vicinity of 20,000 single space modern pages. So that's just massive. That's a huge outpouring of text. And again, dense, difficult, slow, careful, well-argued, well-informed text. So this is an impressive thinker. He died a long time ago. And yet his view that now it's like some of main fundamental aspects of his view are referred to as Thomism, because Thomas Aquinas. In that view, Thomism is still going on strong, especially in Catholic circles. There are Catholic circles in which philosophy just is Thomistic ways of thinking about philosophy. So Thomism is alive and well in many circles. Aquinas is very influential. So let's look a bit more carefully at his direct engagement with the ontological argument, our topic. And he addresses that very early on in the Summa Theologica. So this is Summa Theologica, part 1, question 2, article 1. So this is in the first few pages of his Summa Theologica. And he asks the following question: whether it can be known per se that there is a God. In the per se, I'll explain shortly. But the basic question is, can we know using a reason, using human capacities, that there is a God, or must it be accepted on the basis of faith? And Aquinas, like many other thinkers, think, well, we can accept on the basis of faith. Of course, a lot of people do, but we can also know. We can prove that there's a God in some sense of proof, and we'll look at those later. But in this context, it is in the context of asking to what extent, and well, whether we can, and if we can, to what extent can we know things about God, that the divine, about God, about whether God exists. It is in this context that he engages with the ontological argument. So let's look a little bit more about the context. The respondeo is the I respond, which is his answer to this question. So the question is whether God can be known per se, whether we can know that God exists per se. And here's what he says. A thing can be known per se or in itself. That's a little translation from the Latin, but not be self-evident to us. Or it can be known per se or in itself and be self-evident to us. So a thing, a belief, a proposition can be knowable per se, knowable in itself. And then depending on our cognitive capacities, we can know it. It might be that there are things that are knowable in themselves, but are just beyond our capacities. And a good example would be like a very sophisticated mathematical theorem. A very sophisticated mathematical theorem, if you're a great mathematician, you might just be able to see it and realize it's true, like see the proof that leads to it. But most of us, non-brilliant mathematicians, would just not be able to understand it. Even if we try to follow through the proofs, steps will be too complicated, too abstract, too like beyond our capacities. And the theorem itself will remain knowable in itself. That is, if someone has the right intellectual capacities, can just see through it. But it wouldn't be knowable to us, the non-brilliant mathematicians. This is the distinction he's making, Aquinas is making, but more generally about anything that is knowable in itself. And he gives you a little bit of a definition of what it is to be knowable in itself. A proposition is known or knowable in itself per se because the predicate is contained in the essence of the subject. And his example is Socrates is rational. Aquinas thinks that the essence of humanity is to be a rational animal. If you know the word human and you understand it, you understand it by grasping the essence of the thing that is human, the nature of humanity, the essence of humanity, and that is an animal rationality. That is the essence. So because the essence of a human is to be a rational animal, to say of a particular human that it is rational is just to ascribe part of the essence or something that follows from the essence to an instance of the essence to the human. So to say that Socrates is rational is to say something that one can deduce by just grasping the essence of Socrates. The predicate, being rational, follows from the essence, is contained in the essence of Socrates. So if you know what the word Socrates means, you know that Socrates is human, and you know what the word human means, you know that human is rational animality, then you know that Socrates is rational. You don't have to do any empirical investigation. You just grasp the nature of these terms. That's what it is to know something per se. In Aquinas thinks that the proposition God exists is of that sort. If we were to grasp the nature of God, the essence of God, what divinity amounts to, we would see that existence follows. So this sounds a lot like the ontological argument. If we were to grasp the nature of God, the essence of God, we would see that it is in God's essence to be, to exist. God must exist. And this is knowable per se. It's knowable in itself. Whomever is capable of grasping the essence of God can see, can understand, can directly infer that God must exist. But Aquinas thinks only God can do that. We cannot do that. We're too finite, too limited to grasp God's essence. So we cannot know that God exists just by grasping the essence of God. It is knowable per se that God exists, that proposition, but it's not knowable to us. It's like the mathematical theorem. It's true if you grasp it, but most of us are just not brilliant enough, smart enough. Our cognitive capacities are not that sophisticated. We just cannot grasp it. It's beyond our capabilities. Only God can grasp his own essence. We cannot do so. He's infinite, we're finite. So Aquinas thinks that in principle, we cannot know that God exists simply by grasping the essence of God in the way that he thinks Anselm is doing. Of course, Anselm will say, no, that's not what I'm doing. I'm doing something different. So this is a little bit of the kind of mischaracterization that Aquinas is projecting onto Anselm, unfortunately. And you see them more clearly in the objection. There's an objection to, and the objection to Anselm, to Aquinas' is an answer to the question whether God is knowable, is that, hey, we can know God exists in a priori per se sense, namely the ontological argument. That's the way of knowing that God exists per se. And if you actually read it carefully, you realize the Aquinas' presentation on the ontological argument is not ideal. It's not that well presented. And there you see the distance in space and time, right? 150 years or so have passed. So there are not alive, like great defenders of the sense of to say, no, 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 don't say it that way. Put it more carefully. And unfortunately, that's the record we have from the Summa. And here is Aquinas' actual response to objection 2, which is the ontological argument. Aquinas says, and this is it, this is the whole line that he has. The only thing that follows from Anselm's argument is that our concept of God includes the predicate existing, not that God exists. In other words, Aquinas insists that the only thing that follows from the ontological argument is that we must think of God as existing, not that God exists. The whole ontological argument, claims Aquinas, is just an exercise on the way we must think, but we have to leave it at that. At the end, the conclusion should not be therefore God exists, but rather therefore we must think of God as existing. We can't but think of God as existing. However, that does not show that God exists. It can't show that God exists. Aquinas is an empiricist. He is a scientist. He thinks that the way of knowing reality begins with the senses. Reason operates upon the senses, but it has to be mediated through the senses. He talks about the 5 windows onto reality, which are the senses. Reason, for it to know that we're talking about the real stuff, must operate upon the senses. That we see, that we touch, that we smell, is the way of trusting that we're in touch with reality. And then it is a reason operating upon those deliverance of the senses that should be trusted. That is the science. That is the reason thinking upon the senses. So for Aquinas, that the ontological argument is a priori, independent of the senses, is not a mark in its favor. It's a mark against it. It makes the ontological argument be unknowable in principle, precisely because none of the premises are empirically verifiable. They're all deliverances of reason alone. And Aquinas thinks that those are not grounded in reality, or at least we have no way of knowing that they're grounded in reality. The only ways for us to know that what we're thinking about is grounded in reality, is reflective of reality, is through the senses. That's empiricism. That's scientific thinking in some general sense. Because none of the premises are empirically verifiable, the senses cannot testify to their veracity, their truth. That means that we cannot know the conclusion of the argument. So Aquinas rejects the ontological argument, not by pointing to a premise and arguing that it is false, but rather by refusing to engage in the game of reasoning about the logic of being, like Anselm does, and rather just rejecting the assumption that we can think about reality in a way that is not mediated by the senses. So Aquinas is very different from Plato. Aquinas is very different from Anselm. And as we'll see shortly, Aquinas thinks that we can prove that God exists, but it has to be mediated by the senses. It has to be by doing science. We do science and we conclude that God exists. So that's the basic response that Aquinas has. I do want to put forth Anselm's reply, though, and merely saying what Aquinas just said, or what I said on behalf of Aquinas, need not show that he's right. Like, it's not yet to refute Anselm. Anselm will reply by saying something like, well, you, Aquinas, think that the senses are the connection to reality. Why should I think so? I realize that the senses are fallible, that they make mistakes. And reason, like math, is the one infallible guide to truth, right? So Aquinas, Anselm will say something like, what premise have you denied in my argument? You cannot just reject the argument. It is irrational to recognize that the argument is valid and reject it unless you point to a premise and show why it is false. Your refusal to play the game does not mean you're right. Quite the opposite. My argument stands, right? So Anselm need not be moved by anything that Aquinas said. And this is a very fundamental disagreement about how humans know reality. Do we begin by trusting the senses and then reasoning upon that? And that's our guide to reality, that's Aquinas. Or do we begin by noticing that the senses are deceptive, that they make mistakes here and there, or that they're not accurate? and then we reason our way to correct the deliverance of the senses. That's Plato, that's Hanson. Those are very fundamental disagreements about how humans ultimately know reality. So let me stop there. I will see you next time. We'll look at more Aquinas later. Bye.